Hello again, everyone. I'm Father Joe Nazzle from Sonino Mission House in Berkeley. Last week on our Lenten journey, we experienced kind of a spring break as we went up to the mountain of Transfiguration with Jesus. But this Sunday, Jesus is almost experiencing a kind of spring fever. I don't know about you, but since the pandemic began almost a year ago, I've been taking my temperature every morning. Well, if you took Jesus' temperature in this Sunday's gospel, when he goes into the temple and find money changers and traders buying and selling their goods, he would definitely be running a fever. It's interesting that in John's gospel, the cleansing of the temple occurs very early on in the gospel, just after the wedding feast of Cana. It's kind of what you might call a post-Cana conference. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the placement of the story is right before his passion, which many scholars indicate this was the last straw, that Jesus turning the temple upside down was a way for the scribes and Pharisees to have Jesus arrested. And regardless of when it happened, this much is clear. It's not a traditional spring cleaning of the temple. Jesus doesn't use mops and brooms to drive out the dirt and dust of the money changers. He uses a whip out of cords. And his spring cleaning is viewed as a prophetic action that brought to people's minds the fire and fury of the Old Testament prophets who tried to get people to reform their lives, to turn their lives around. We see a side of Jesus in this Sunday's gospel we don't often like to look at, his anger. But it's an anger fueled by his zeal. His passion for protecting the sacredness of the temple causes Jesus' blood to boil, and his passion runs in the divine bloodstream. The first reading for this Sunday is the reading from Exodus, where God says to Moses, "I am your God. I brought you out of slavery. I'm a jealous God." In Hebrew, my understanding is that the same word is used for zealous and jealous, that jealous and zeal are the same word. And so it's as if God is the divine lover who is passionately in love with us and zealously concerned for our welfare. We see the same fire in Jesus' eyes as he turns over a few tables and turns a few heads to enable people to see that this is a house of prayer and it's been cluttered with too much commerce and complacency, filled with competition and a cacophony of false prayers and piety. Don't you see, Jesus seems to scream, this house of prayer is where the divine lover seeks to meet the beloved. As we enter the third week of Lent, I guess one of the questions we might ask ourselves is if we caught spring fever yet. Do we sense that fire burning in our heart shrines for new life to emerge, especially after this very difficult past year of the pandemic? Can we sense the ground groaning beneath our feet, ready to erupt with new hope? Can we touch the ashes that have grown cold and feel the divine lover stirring the ashes of our lives until they become the embers that spark new flames of faith? Paul describes the instrument that God uses to stir into flame our burnt-out hopes and dreams. In the second reading, Paul says the cross is the instrument that Jesus uses to get the ground ready for new birth. The cross, Paul writes, is what we preach. It's what we live. Christ crucified may seem foolish to some, ridiculous to others, a stumbling block and an absurdity. But when those sacred temples we call our hearts are cleansed of all the distortions and the distractions, we see the cross for what it is: our forgiveness, our redemption, our absolution from our sin, the ladder that leads to the very heart of God. Jesus' love for humanity was so passionate that he was nailed to the cross. The cross is the consequence for living passionately and intensely. Because of the vision and the values that Jesus lived and taught, a new way of living, a new way of forgiving, a new way of loving, Jesus was crucified. Do we live with such passion? Perhaps the question we face midway through our Lenten journey is, what crosses have we been nailed to recently because we've lived the message of the gospel with intensity and passion? God desires to cleanse the temple of our hearts with the grace and mercy of the divine lover. The fire of God's zealous, jealous, forgiving love frees us from sin and sweeps away the debris of denial and despair that has cluttered the temple of our hearts. How do we learn to live and forgive as Jesus did? During this pandemic, almost every day I've tried to go for long walks to get some fresh air, wearing my double masks and keeping a social distance. And I often listen to podcasts. And one of my favorite podcasts is from NPR, the StoryCorps podcast. There was one recently that reflects the kind of commitment to live and forgive as Jesus did. The story was about a father whose son was murdered more than 25 years ago in a gang-related robbery. And he was meeting with and forgiving the man who had killed his son. Tony Hicks was only 14 years old when he shot and killed Tariq Charisma. And at the time, he was the youngest person charged as an adult in California. Tariq's father, Azim, invited Tony to sit down with him 25 years after the murder to reflect on how their lives were changed by what Tony had done. 5 years after the murder, Azim said he worked up enough courage to visit Tony in prison. He asked Tony in the StoryCorps podcast what he remembered about that first meeting. And Tony recalled that they met in the visiting room of the Folsom State Prison. "I'd been anxious over meeting you," he said. "I felt so horrible for what I had done that I wanted to be able to do something, anything, to help you heal in some type of way." Azim tells Tony that he was amazed at Tony's his composure. Remember, by this time, 5 years after the murder, Tony was still only 19 years old. Tony says that coming to a maximum security prison at 16, he had to grow up very quickly. He had to become as mature as possible just to survive in there, he said. Tony said the first time he met Azim, it was the most difficult conversation he ever had in his life. Tony was remorseful and took responsibility for what he had done. And in that moment, Azim tells him, "I got the spark in you. The spark in you that was no different from the spark in me. It was at that point," he said, "that I knew I had forgiven you." Tony tells Azim that he didn't feel like he was deserving of his forgiveness because of the son he had taken away from him. "But your example," Tony said, "gave me the space to work on understanding that I was worth being forgiven." Azim tells Tony that he always felt that forgiveness was something that you give yourself. And he knew he didn't want to go through life feeling anger and revenge all the time. After Tony was released from prison in 2019, he told Azim that he wanted to go back to the place where he murdered his son, where he murdered Tariq, and bring his past and his present together in that moment. He said, "I wanted to affirm to Tariq that I was a changed person, that I wouldn't squander this opportunity." Azim affirms Tony, and Tony tells Azim, "You are instrumental in the person I am today. I'm extraordinarily grateful to know you and to have you in my life." Tony now volunteers for the Justice Foundation that Azim founded in memory of his son, the foundation named for his son in San Diego. Azim and Tony show what true forgiveness can do, how people's lives can be changed, no matter how horrendous the crime. Even as the vaccines become more available to stop the spread of the coronavirus, Jesus hopes that the spring fever of God's forgiving love is contagious, so that all of us would catch this passion, this fire, because this zealous love prepares us and prepares our world for a new birth, a new creation, and changes our lives forever. I pray you and your family have a blessed week. Stay safe. Take good care as we continue to meet in prayer.